So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. Do you number your days?
And if there is anything that has more of my heart, more of my passion, more of my affections, it is glorified above him.
The more you love God, the more you hate those things that dishonor him.
All these little choices of the bad rather than the good, they are steps on the path to hell.
Hello, and welcome to How to Walk Like a Giant. I'm Jonathan, and today I wanted to talk about Augustine of Hippo. If you don't know who he is, he's considered one of the most influential figures in Christian history. He really set the foundations of the Reformation and Western thought in general. I read his Confessions book and just found his reflections helpful for my own life, and that's really the reason why I wanted to talk about Augustine. His story is so relatable to many of us and how we made his spiritual transformation. So here's the plan. I'm going to give a brief overview of his life, highlight those key moments, and along the way, share my key takeaways I had from my notes and studying up on him. So sit back, listen up, and let's dive in. The one thing which really stands out about Augustine is that he wasn't always the saint that we know today. In fact, he was probably closer to our modern-day Wolf of Wall Street type of character. He was super ambitious and successful. He had fame, fortune, and power. He partied a lot, and he indulged himself in the world, especially with lust. And yet, through it all, he felt a sense of restlessness in his heart. He knew something was missing, but he couldn't just put a finger on it until later in life. Let's start from the beginning and see how he became the giant that we know today. Augustine was born in 354 AD in the small town of Thagaste, which is now called Souk Aras in modern-day Algeria in North Africa. His father, Patricius, was a Roman official, non-Christian. His dad was your typical Roman citizen, ambitious, focused on material success, and indulged in worldly pleasures. On the other side was his mother, Monica, who was a devout Christian. One thing which is mentioned consistently about his mom is that she continuously prayed for Augustine's conversion throughout his childhood and early adult life. So, growing up, Augustine was caught between these two influences of his father and mother, and although he admired his mom's faith, young Augustine was drawn towards the pleasures and excitement of the material world. He was actually really smart growing up, and like most gifted kids, he found more excitement in mischief, and so his childhood was filled with small rebellions, acts that seemed harmless but revealed deeper tendencies towards pride and indulgence. One of the most famous stories from Augustine's early years is that he would steal pears from his neighbor's orchard. He didn't steal the pears because he was hungry or in need. He stole them simply for the thrill of doing something forbidden. This is what he wrote about it. Quote, "I love my own ruin. I loved to sin. Not that which I stole, but the theft and sin itself delighted me." End quote. This was almost like a symptom for what was happening in his soul. Augustine was aware that he was doing wrong, but he took pleasure in it anyway. Anyways, fast forwarding a bit, his dad recognized his son's intellectual potential and was determined to give him the best education possible, even at great financial cost. In the Roman world, education was a pathway to status and success, and Patricius saw his son's intellect as a way to elevate the family's social standing. He first sent Augustine to study grammar and rhetoric in the nearby city of Madoros, which is where his academic talents really began to flourish. It was during this period that Augustine's love for classical literature blossomed. He became enamored with the works of Virgil, Cicero, and other great Roman writers, and this fueled his ambition to become a master of rhetoric. Augustine was not only brilliant, he was competitive. He wanted to outshine his peers, earn public recognition, and climb the social ladder. Yet even as he pursued these goals, he felt increasingly lost. He had this nagging sense that something was missing in his life. The more that he achieved, the more dissatisfied he became. The pursuit of academic success came at a spiritual cost. Augustine's immersion in classical literature exposed him to pagan ideals that glorified fame, pleasure, and personal achievement. And by doing so, it distanced him from his mother's Christian teachings. His mom would often plead with him to embrace Christianity, but Augustine was not ready to let go of his ambitions. He found Christianity too simple, too restrictive for someone with his intellectual aspirations. He preferred philosophies that promised knowledge and power, and he dismissed his mom's faith as the religion of the unlearned. In his late teenage years, Augustine moved to Carthage to continue his education. Carthage was a bustling city filled with opportunities and temptations, and it was here that Augustine fully indulged in the pleasures of the world. He took a lover and eventually had a son. It was here in Carthage where Augustine continued to search for meaning and purpose as well. He couldn't shake this feeling that something was missing in his soul. He started to explore other belief systems, including Manichaeism. They were a religious sect that promised to explain the struggle between good and evil. The Manichaeans taught that the world was divided into two opposing forces, light and darkness, spirit and matter. The Manichaeans gave Augustine a framework to understand his inner conflict, and it really allowed him to justify his behavior. If the material world was inherently evil, then Augustine's indulgence in pleasure was not entirely his fault. It was simply the result of being trapped in a flawed world. However, this belief system only gave him temporary relief from the guilt. Over time, Augustine realized that their explanations were shallow and that their leaders couldn't answer his deepest questions, and so he eventually left their faith. Augustine continued his rise in his academic career. He moved from Carthage to Rome and then to Milan. He was 30 when he moved to Milan, and this is an important part of his life. He had achieved professional success at this point. He had gained the prestigious position as a teacher of rhetoric, but the sense of emptiness still remained. He was admired by students, he was respected by colleagues, he was in a long-term relationship, and so by all outward appearances he was thriving. And yet inside, Augustine felt as if he were living two lives. One part of him was consumed by pride, pleasure, and ambition, while another part of him longed for something deeper. He wrote in his book Confessions about this period in his life, saying, quote, "I was in misery, and misery is a state of every soul overcome by friendship with mortal things and lacerated when they are lost," end quote. While in Milan, Augustine finds Ambrose, and Ambrose was the local bishop who would be Augustine's future Christian mentor. Ambrose was smart and elegant and impressed Augustine. Augustine had initially started to attend Ambrose's sermons not out of spiritual interest, but out of professional curiosity. As a fellow public speaker, Augustine loved how Ambrose was able to combine rhetoric techniques with theology, and over time, Augustine found himself drawn almost reluctantly to his message. What struck Augustine was the way Ambrose interpreted Scripture. Unlike the literal interpretations that Augustine had encountered earlier in his life, Ambrose employed allegory, revealing layers of meaning that transcended the surface of the text. Augustine later wrote in Confessions that Ambrose's teaching opened his mind to the possibility that Christianity was a lot more profound than he had previously understood. Augustine saw that Christianity could be intellectually respectable, and this was important to him. However, Augustine wasn't yet ready to let go of his old life. He wanted to change, but he felt powerless to do so. He described his inner conflict in this way, quote, "I was a prisoner, bound not by iron chains, but by the bondage of my own will," end quote. Okay, so we're finally at the climax. This is the point where Augustine converts to Christianity. It's a bit of an odd story. So Augustine is in a garden in Milan one afternoon. He's emotionally distraught. He feels so empty about the life which he's lived, and even though he has all of this worldly success, something's still missing. He's not ready to put aside his worldly ambitions and lust, but he doesn't know what to do. And then out of nowhere, he starts to hear a voice of a child say, "Take and read, take and read." He hears it, and he's a bit confused. So he ends up running around in this garden, finds a spot with a Bible on it, and he opens it up to Romans 13, verses 13 to 14, which says, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. In that moment, as soon as he finished that sentence, Augustine committed himself to Christ. He wrote in his book Confessions, quote, "It was as though the light of certainty flooded my heart, and all the darkness of doubt was dispelled," end quote. Ambrose finally baptized Augustine in 384 AD, and he made this incredible 180-degree transformation in his life. He gave up his teaching career, he renounced his former relationships, and he committed himself to a life of prayer and study. Augustine described this transition saying, quote, "To be freed from my ambitions was sweeter joy to me than all the honors I had once pursued," end quote. This story of Augustine's conversion was really interesting to read for me, primarily because it's so relatable. You have that restlessness he was describing. Even though it looked like he had everything in the world, he still felt something was missing. In a day and age where self-sufficiency and building financial wealth is king, it was a good reminder that even when you've accumulated enough, you'll always feel empty inside. But on the flip side, having that feeling can actually be a gift. It helps us recognize that we were created for something beyond what the world alone can provide. It's that inner stirring, that gentle but persistent reminder that there is more to life than work and money. It helps us ask those deep life questions such as, who am I? What is my purpose in life? Which then ultimately point us to God. And so this was a really good piece of encouragement I took away from his conversion story. The other thing I loved was just reaffirming the magnitude of God's grace. It doesn't matter who you are or what you've done, God's grace is always available. Augustine was entrenched in the world and didn't want to give it up for the longest time. And yet, slowly but surely, God broke down his walls and called him to himself. Not only that, we're going to see that despite his past sins and mistakes, Augustine became one of the greatest saints and theologians in the history of the church. A recurring theme on this podcast is that God is able to use ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and it's just amazing to read about. Okay, let's continue with Augustine's story. After his baptism, Augustine wanted to live a simple life. He started to head back home to Algeria with his son, mother, and close friends. His goal was to create a small Christian community on his family estate. His mom ends up dying from old age along the way, but he eventually makes it back to his hometown, Thagaste. Even though Augustine wanted to live a quiet life alone, God had other plans for him. In 391 AD, so Augustine is 37 years old at this point, he travels to the city of Hippo to visit a friend. So this is modern-day Annaba, Algeria, which is about a 2-hour drive north of his hometown. Now, this is a bit of an odd story. While attending his friend's church, he ends up being coerced by the local congregation to be their pastor. The congregants recognized his intellect and demanded that Augustine should be ordained as a priest to assist their aging bishop. Now, putting yourself in his shoes, you can see why Augustine was pretty reluctant on saying yes. He tried to put them off, but the congregants wouldn't have it. And this is the interesting part about all this. Their unwillingness to let him leave was a sign to Augustine that this was ultimately God's will. He would later write that, quote, "He was constrained by the will of God through the will of the people, and thus I entered into ministry unwillingly." And so this is really interesting. I'm not sure how you would react, but if I felt trapped in the church by a bunch of people I didn't quite know, I definitely wouldn't contemplate being their pastor. And so this was just kind of a weird, shocking event to read about. I feel like I'm still processing it, to be honest. But it does raise a flag for me about being more sensitive to where God might want me to be, either through the conversations I have or by things which come across my way or by any other means. I think it's easy to stick to our own plans and turn down opportunities to serve because they don't fit with what we've mapped out for ourselves. So I think that's just something I made a mental note about in my brain, which I'm going to take away. Continuing on, as a priest, Augustine devoted himself to preaching and pastoral care. He was eloquent from his education and training, and his theological insights quickly gained him a reputation as one of the most brilliant Christian leaders of his time. He wrote several books and sermons, and some of His most famous works are Confessions and The City of God. His ideas served as a starting point for so many later on, such as Martin Luther, John Calvin, René Descartes, and Immanuel Kant. He defended Christianity from heresy and other beliefs. One of his most significant points was that he clarified the doctrine of original sin. He actually developed that doctrine and emphasized the grace from God which is necessary for salvation. There's more to what he did as the Bishop of Hippo. I think it's funny to think that when he was baptized, he just wanted to live a hermit lifestyle. There's no such thing as spiritual retirement. God called him to use his previous skills to preach, to write, and to articulate the gospel to others. And so this was just a good reminder for me to make sure that I'm using my talents no matter what stage of life that I'm going to be in. Augustine left such a lasting legacy on the world today, and I've already shared a bit about my key takeaways from his story. The last thing I'll share is that good things take time. One of the most relatable aspects of Augustine's life is that his conversion didn't happen overnight. It was a long, painful process marked by resistance, failure, and inner conflict. He spent years searching for meaning in philosophy, pleasure, and ambition before surrendering to God. His story shows that spiritual growth is often a gradual journey, not an instant transformation. And so this was a good reminder for me not to be discouraged if change feels slow. God works in the heart even when we can't see immediate results. And so there we have it. That's Augustine and how he became a Christian giant. I hope this episode encouraged you and helped you reflect on your own life. Don't forget to follow this podcast if you haven't already and share it with others. I'll see you in the next one. Go in peace.
So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. Do you number your days?
And if there is anything that has more of my heart, more of my passion, more of my affections, it is glorified above him.
The more you love God, the more you hate those things that dishonor him.
All these little choices of the bad rather than the good, they are steps on the path to hell.